Hello and welcome to the Sight and Sound Video History Series of the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library. I'm Tom Walton. Today we talk with a man who, in my view, defines public service. He's been a member of the Ohio General Assembly for many years. He served the Ohioans as Speaker of the House for a number of years, and later in his life became a member of the judiciary, serving as a Wood County Common Pleas Court judge. He is the Honorable Charles F. Kurfess, a man I've known and admired and respected for many years. Going all the way back, I suppose, to the 1970s when I was in the Blades Columbus Bureau. And Chuck, it's great to have you with us today. Thanks for joining us for Sight and Sound.
Always good to talk to you, Tom.
Let's talk a little bit about your childhood. You've been a Northwest Ohioan since birth. You were born in Wood County. Was that at home or in a hospital?
I don't remember clearly, but I'm sure it was at home. Actually, probably in Webster Township.
Can you tell us about your first home? What do you remember about it?
Well, I don't remember that one because I was probably a couple years old when we moved out onto Route 20, just between Stony Ridge and Woodville on a tenant farm that we lived there till I was about 10. So that's the first home I really remember as tenant farmers. About when I was 10, my dad bought his old home farm in Perrysburg Township, and that's where I really grew up, although I have the Depression Day memories are out on Route 20, where I think my folks for a while had a sign out front, Twin Pines Tourist Home, for the heavy traveling public on Route 20. In those days, it was not unusual at all for Mom to be fixing a meal for somebody who stopped hitchhiking down the road, and I'm sitting on the back porch chatting with these guys while they were eating our...
Sounds like sort of a bed and breakfast, a little bit ahead of its time.
Yes, right.
So tell us about your mom and dad. Your father, I believe, was John. Your mother's name was Margaret. Can you talk about your parents?
My mom grew up in Lime City, or just south of Lime City on Lime City Road there. Family of 4 girls, some Swiss ancestry. She graduated from Perrysburg High School, then attended Bowling Green University in its normal days, and taught school for a few years. First taught in a one-room schoolhouse there on Lime City Road, 8 grades, and she was the janitor and everything else. And then taught a few years in the Lime City
Your father
school.
was a farmer.
Yes, farm family. And of course, in those days when she got married, they quit teaching. Dad was farmer right there in Perrysburg Township, other than when we lived in Troy Township there in Route 20. Went to the old Kurfess school there in the corner. I'm not sure what grade he left school in, 6th or 7th, about there. Did not attend high school. I remember finding in old papers how his mother had been on the little school board there at that one-room school, but and farmed all his life, active in the agricultural organizations and such, but also served on school boards for probably over 30 years. First on the North Troy board where we lived. We moved into the old Troy Lucky District. He was on that board. I remember standing outside my car at home getting ready to go somewhere, probably my college days or so, and my dad saying, someday there's going to be a new high school out there between Lucky and Pemberville, for Lucky, Pemberville, and Webster. And I'm saying, yeah, Dad, I think you're right. I'm not sure you'll see it. See it? He helped put it together and was on that first Eastwood School Board until Webster moved in. He resigned so somebody from Webster could go on it. He was later on that board, the Wood County Board, the Penna County Board, which organized the first vocational high school, Penna County, and he was on that board. So
what an achievement for someone who didn't go to high school.
Very much, but probably not that unusual for that generation. But yeah, it sure was.
I know you had siblings. Can you talk about them?
Older sister, a retired physician in the Cleveland area. Two younger brothers, one who stayed in the Perrysburg area and farmed for a while, then was in real estate and some development. Our youngest brother had his doctorate in nuclear physics, but ended up working for the government, actual Navy research, but a lot with NASA, was in charge of putting together a scientific experiment on gamma rays, which was launched into orbit with the first shot we had after the tragedy of the, so he made his name in that field.
What a family of achievers, obviously, yourself included. You touched on this briefly, Chuck, but you were a child during the Depression.
Yeah.
And you talk about the tourist home. How in other ways did the Depression affect your family and your household?
Well, I don't think it affected me because I wasn't aware of it.
We always hear the expression, we were poor, but we didn't know it. Did that apply in your case?
Thinking back now, I'm thinking about some of our Depression meals. And since we lived on the farm and had the usual farm undertaking those days, chickens and milk, dairy cows and beef, cattle, and maybe some pig, we didn't suffer in that regard. I used to, we still have some of the Depression meals like scrambled eggs and rice flavored with cinnamon, soft-boiled eggs broken over fried potatoes, bread and gravy. The one that surprises people most is a meal of strawberry shortcake. We had it.
That sounds fine to me.
It's still fine. You're right. So in some respects, it didn't hit me that hard, although we had hired men, probably as much to help them as to help with the farm and things like that.
You were born in 1930.
Correct.
So you would have turned 11 when the United States entered World War II, right?
Remember it very well.
Can you tell us about that?
I was out in the barn with my older cousin playing basketball on Sunday afternoon, shooting it in the old tomato hamper that I'd commandeered for a basket, and Dad came out and told us about the attack on Pearl Harbor. From that point on, for the next 4 or 5 years, I think I spent every night sitting on the floor in front of the old radio listening to the evening news, which was war news. In 45, when the war is over, my first thought was, we're not going to have the evening news anymore. That's what the evening news was. And I just thought, well, there's not going to be any news anymore. The war's over.
Were you angry when your father told you about Pearl Harbor? I mean, you're 11 years old. That's a very impressionable age, of course. And you're starting to think in terms a little bit more beyond your own home.
Oh, the tragedy of it, and perhaps not quite fully understanding why, which I pick up now, of course, from reading and exploring history. But it was just one of those daily things. That's what we lived with. I had older cousins who went to the service. I think 4 of them out of one family. And, and this doesn't sound real good, but we get concerned, like the wars we've been involved in. 3 and 4, 6-month, 8-month tours of duty in the Middle East and so forth. Some of those guys went for 4 years. No R&R back home. So it was a different kind of service, a different kind of war, as we realize.
Well, the war ended, of course, in the mid-40s, in 1945. And 2 years later, in 1947, you graduated from high school. That was the old Troy Lucky High School, right?
A senior class of 16.
I was going to ask you about that. That must have been a closely knit group.
Very much so, and like I think many others, maybe in the last 25, 30 years, we've gotten a little closer. Just recently we lost a member, and I think there's 8 of the 16 still surviving, approaching our 65th year or so.
Now, the school didn't survive, is that right? Troy Lucky High School is long gone now. What is it now? I believe, is it Eastwood?
That's part of Eastwood.
Can you tell us about your high school years, what sort of activities you were involved in? Student government, perhaps? Was there an awakening occurring within you about public service?
We had a little student government, yeah, and I was involved in that. But we didn't have all the activities that they have today, like they have a society for honor society and things like that. But I did get involved also in those days in 2 other areas, which probably whetted my appetite and really grounded me in some kind of, if you want to call it, leadership role. One was the Farm Bureau Youth Group that I got involved with, and eventually I think I was on the state board. I think I was on the American Farm Bureau Youth Committee for a year or so. And the other one was our church youth group, the Luther League, where I got involved and statewide and that sort of thing. I think those 2 things contributed to my ultimate election and involved in public office.
Now, after graduation from high school, you went on to Bowling Green. Well, why BG for your college? Is it because your mother had gone there?
Yes, probably cost as much as anything, and proximity. I remember looking at least a couple other schools. I always said, Wittenberg still owes me $25. I mailed them a pre-registration, and I think I looked at Worcester for some reason, I'm not sure, but ended up at Bowling Green for...
Did you know what you wanted to do with your life at that point when you went off to college?
I had a junior high teacher for 1 year. This is during wartime when teachers came and went, out of retirement, who first, I think, was ever suggested to me that I ought to think about the law. Why he said that, I don't know. In fact, he gave me I would say, a young person's biography of Lincoln with a nice inscription, which I loaned to somebody years later, and I'd like to get that book back.
In other words, don't ever loan a book, right? You never get it
That's
back.
right. But that was probably my first indication that maybe I'd be interested in the law.
What was your major at Bowling Green?
Technically, I think it was economics, but as a pre-law, I took an awful lot of liberal arts as well as business.
So you weren't thinking law at this point?
Yeah. Students in college used to ask me, well, what program should I go in if I mentioned the law? And I said, you can either go liberal arts or business, either way. But if you go liberal arts, take as much business as you can get. If you go business, take as much liberal arts as you can get. So, and I think it's still that, from what I hear.
Now, you pursued your degree, and you graduated from Bowling Green in 1951, is that right?
Correct.
You also received a fellowship at Wayne State University in Detroit. What was that about?
That was Wayne University then. It was a city school, just like Toledo was at that time. I heard about it through the university. I had, why I did this, I'm not sure. I was a liberal arts student primarily. But I took a sort of an exam for Procter and Gamble. Eventually, they all had 2 of us from Bowling Green come down for an interview, and they offered me a position as a starting. And also at the same time became aware of this fellowship in Detroit. It was funded by Citizens Research Council of Michigan. And so it was working for them and going to graduate school. And so that's when I had to make the decision of business or quasi-government, and made that decision there and spent a year there. I did not get a degree because I went right to the service, toyed with the idea of doing my thesis on something government in Japan because I was spending a year in Tokyo, and gave that up real quick.
Well, you mentioned the military, and of course in 1952 you did join the Army.
Don't make that sound too voluntary. I was drafted.
Okay, you were drafted. All right, we won't give you more extra credit, but you did serve your country, and that's important. In fact, you were in the Counterintelligence Corps. Can you talk about that service and what your responsibilities were?
Yeah, now I was in Tokyo, so I hedge a little bit when I say, this was during the Korean War, but I don't feel like I'm a Korean veteran in terms of those guys who spent their time in Korea. But at that time, post-war, U.S. Army occupation, it was interesting. We had our own bus routes, everything. So we were really active throughout the country. In counterintelligence, you're interested in learning about, watching various groups, various individuals, and so forth. Interestingly, at that time, we were there as occupiers. Russia had not, I don't know if they actually entered the war, but they had not entered into any agreement with Japan. So they were there with want of a better term, a diplomatic corps, but I think they were restricted on any new people coming in. And at that point, we were as interested in watching them as they were interested in watching us. So that was a lot of it. You say, can you talk about it? One of my roles at times, among other things, was typing up reports. And I remember coming into the office one morning, typing this report of what went on the night before in terms of a Russian diplomat turning over and coming to us. Now, I had done reports on this guy before, and so we knew a little bit about him. And I typed up this report about what transpired. Several months later, my folks had subscribed to the Blade for me, and so I'd get these Blades to read from back home, which is nice. I'm reading the Blade, and here's this column by the Alsop brothers. It looked like my report. For the first time, somebody writing about what had transpired, because we had denied we ever heard of the guy, how those things go. And so I cut it out. I walk in the next office and lay it on the major's desk, and he looks at it. And typically Army, he attaches it, I think, to an SF-5 form or something, stamps secret on it, and ships it up, But it intrigued me because obviously somebody in the government has said it's time to let people know what happened. And
So here's something that's already been publicly disseminated in the newspaper, and it's stamped top secret.
Yeah, it's only in the Army.
So you spent a year in that role, and you came back to Ohio, and back to the States, and enrolled in law school, in fact, at Ohio State.
Yeah, I think in those days, if you're going to go back to school, you gotta get out of the service at that time of the year, maybe a couple weeks early. So I came back, went right into law school.
Why Ohio State? Was it the proximity, the convenience, the expense?
I have no idea if I even applied anywhere else. I just don't remember, but it was the natural.
And so you began your law school career at Ohio State, and at some point early on, you were hired as a page in the Ohio Senate.
Yeah.
Was the political bug beginning to bite?
That started earlier. I remember probably in high school, some group was down in Columbus visiting the State House. And I remember having somebody take a picture of me walking down the steps of the Capitol building. Wasn't the first time, that was the first time that picture was taken, but I had an interest in fact, I followed stuff pretty closely in the Blade, and I'm not sure, well, my interest in politics and government started in 1940, 10 years old, and listening at the radio to the Republican National Convention, and followed that kind of thing all along. So I had a particular interest in government, and for some reason in the state legislature. So I learned about the Page job, and Del Latta was our state senator, and he got, well, a job as a page in the Senate.
That must have been exciting for a young man.
It was a darn good job. It paid pretty well, and you could study while you were there, and you were right there watching. Yeah, it was, to anybody that had any interest at all, it was being as close you could be without being a member.
Now, it's interesting, in 1940, you hung on every word out of the Republican National Convention. Was there ever any doubt in your mind that you were going to become a Republican? How did that come about?
My dad, I'm sure, was a Republican. My maternal grandfather was a pretty committed, active Democrat. I remember talking with him about the time when Roosevelt and the Democrats were wondering if they should dump Wallace as the candidate for vice president. I remember talking with my grandfather about that. I always watched the primaries in both Republican and Democrat. I'd read the ads and the stories in the newspapers, and the sample ballots, and I cast ballot in both ways. And I talked to my mother about it. She had to take the Democrat ballot, the primary. She could not go to that voting precinct with her father sitting there, an active Democrat, and ask for a Republican ballot.
Well, that wouldn't have gone over very well, no, I don't imagine. And while you were at law school, you met and married your wife, your soulmate.
56 was a vintage year.
Yeah. Well, that was quite a year for you.
I won a very contested primary, got married, and won the general election. Pretty good year.
I would say so, yeah. How did you and Helen meet, Helen Rudolph?
We grew up in the same community, same church, never dated or anything, came back from the service, became somewhat acquainted with her again. She taught first grade at Lake. My mother was teaching third grade at Lake, maybe in the adjacent classroom. So Helen, my wife, was a subject of my mother's comments once in a while. And she never took credit for getting us together, but I'm sure she felt a good deal of credit.
So a matchmaker mom, huh?
Yes.
Yes, indeed. 1956 was a big year. You mentioned your hotly contested campaign.
In the primary.
In the primary for a seat in the Ohio House of Representatives, Chuck. What motivated you? You're still in law school. What was your motivation to run for public office?
Well, a lot of it's timing. I'm knowing what I would like to, by then I'd like to be in the legislature. I talked with Fred Chambers in Lucky, who was a vice chairman of the Republican Party in Wood County at the time, and he mentioned that some people seem to be a little dissatisfied with our present state representative, who had been there 20 years. And so sometime later I said to him, "Are you one of those who are a little dissatisfied?" "Oh, no, he wasn't." But then when I got to be a page, somewhere I got some lead into, hey, that might be a viable alternative or option. So I talked to Fred and then other leaders in the party, and found that I would have some support even in the primary. So I finally decided to run, And I told them, well, I'm going to go talk to Mr. Longnecker, our present representative, just as a courtesy. Oh, no, don't do that. Because if you go talk to him, he'll say, oh, just one more term. Next time you can, they'll talk you out of it. So we had about 4 or 5 weekly newspapers in Wood County at the time. So the day came, I'm going to go around and all the papers, I'm going to give them my release. I'm going to Pemberville last. And after I give it the Pemberville paper, I'll go across the street, because Mr. Longnecker lived there, and tell him what I'm. By then, he can't talk me out of it.
You're committed.
And eventually, he did not run for re-election, and decided to run for Congress instead. I suppose in part, if he's got to put on a campaign, might as well do. Cliff Clevenger was probably serving his last term, and so that's how I ended up in that race with eventually 2 others.
Did you have an opponent in the general election from the Democrats?
Yes, from North Baltimore, a member of the Wood County Board of Education.
Essentially, in other words, that race was over in the primary, right?
In those days, yes.
That's a Republican district.
That's right. Okay. In fact, in urging young people to get involved, I used to use that election as an example. I'd give them the figures about what Republican votes I got in the primary, what I got in the general election, and essentially, I probably suggested, if every Republican who had voted for me in the general election had voted in the primary, I may not have won the primary, because the other candidate, especially the president of the city council in Bowling Green, if they'd all voted, I'm not sure I could have won.
Now, starting a family was important to you. I know that. You had just gotten married, and you and Helen, and I think you were just in your 3rd year of law school, and you had your first child. Your son, Todd, was born, and now you're not only a young husband, you're a young father and a young legislator. How in the world did you juggle all those responsibilities?
I wouldn't suggest it to anybody. My law studies suffered because I was in the legislature. It seemed a little more interesting downtown at the Capitol building than out at the law school. But I did manage to graduate, I think in the December of '57. But yeah, it was, we actually lived in Columbus in an apartment for about a year. And our first son, our son Todd, was born while we lived in Columbus.
Now, eventually, you also had, 2 daughters?
2 daughters.
Your family is growing. Did you have a mentor as a young lawyer? Someone who took you under his wing?
Well, in those days, I had talked to a number of attorneys in Bowling Green, of course. No particular mentor, but older attorneys were very helpful. Someone like me, you could call half a dozen of them I would call, what, can you help me with this one? So the Bar Association in those days was much smaller, different attitudes, different purposes. So the senior members of the bar always willing to be very helpful. But I didn't join a firm. I had a $5,000 a year salary as a legislator, so I could afford to open my own law office.
When you began your practice of law, what was your intention? To practice law and, oh, by the way, go to Columbus a couple days a week to serve in the legislature?
Well,
Were you attempting to do both?
Yeah. This is not the best way to do things. In fact, that's one of the things that, when I think back of all the things I've done, I'm very dissatisfied in so many ways, because I could have done a lot of things much better than I did. But I like the law and I like the legislature. I'm a devotee of the citizen legislator. Randy Gardner ran the first time after I left the legislature for years, and like many candidates, and Randy's a sort of a protege of mine, he followed he was very active when I was in the legislature in my campaigns and very interested and so forth. But he advertised he'll be a full-time legislator. Randy, I don't want a full-time legislator. I want the legislature to be people who can and are willing and interested in giving up some of their time and effort. Well, that's all passé now. But that's what I was. When the legislature was in session, I really looked forward to getting down there on Monday night. Come Thursday afternoon, I couldn't get out of there fast enough to get back to the law office. I was doing two things that I really enjoyed doing and would have been much better off in either one of them if I'd made that choice. But I was riding two horses.
Well, certainly you were making your mark, Chuck, in Columbus early on. Even in your first term, you were impressing people. You were selected as outstanding freshman legislator by a group that I personally know would be tough critics, having been a member myself of the Ohio Legislative Correspondents Association. OLCA chose you as the outstanding freshman legislator. Did that surprise you as someone who was dividing his time in so many ways?
I didn't know there was such a thing until they told me I was one. Sometimes you wonder, well, how did that happen? You understand that better than I. But I do remember one thing as a freshman that I would probably drew attention. One of the senior members of the House, a very well-respected member, put a bill in to require children be of a certain specific age to enter the first grade. I think the reason was superintendents, at least his superintendent in that county, was tired of being bugged by parents that their kids should get in school and whether they had an age set. They didn't like to make that, let the law say. My wife was a first grade school teacher. She had some thoughts on that subject. So I got up on the floor of the day and spoke against the bill. Don't treat our children as a herd. They're not all alike. Defeated the bill. And I think that drew the attention of some of the news people. It was the right thing to do. And I often thought, gee, did I violate protocol by not going to that senior member and saying, look, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to pose this. If I'd have done that, he would have probably got the votes through friendship to pass it. I don't know, but it was a little bit of my naivete that probably got it accomplished. By the way, I had a couple good committee assignments which gave, and even in those days, at the committee level, you could be involved even if you were.
What were your committees that first term?
Well, one was Metropolitan Areas Committee.
Even though you were from a rural area?
Yeah, and another one, I don't know if I went on this committee or not, but later on, I was Roger Cloud made me chairman of they called it Elections Federal Relations, but it was known as the Blue Ribbon Committee, where they put bills that were controversial or tough. We had health bills, we had public utility bills, we had judicial bills, and so I had a chance for a little exposure.
Now you continued to win re-election to the Ohio House of Representatives, and this was the era before term limits, we should point out. You moved into leadership roles, eventually becoming Speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives in 1967. Is that a job you actively sought, or did it sort of come to you?
Oh no, I sought that. I don't think I didn't plan a political career, as the real results show. But there's one thing that I did. I wasn't in the House very long before I looked at Roger Cloud up in that Speaker's chair and said, that's where I want to be. And so I'd been rather active in some legislative matters, even as a committee chair and such. And Bob Reckman from Cincinnati, who you recall, I'm sure, was Speaker Pro Tem. And I thought one thing to do is maybe run for Speaker Pro Tem, and which I did and was defeated by Bob when he ran for re-election, which was understandable. Then Roger was resigned to become auditor by appointment. Reckman became acting speaker, or whatever you want to call that position. And then I became, because of my challenge before, sort of one that they would anticipate would challenge Bob, which I did. And then I campaigned for that like any other. Traveled the state of Ohio, sat down and talked to new legislators, senior legislators, and won on that because of that kind of campaign. But also, Bob was a very talented guy, not the warmest personality. And so that contributed probably a little bit too.
Even though as Speaker of the House you were leader of the Republican Party in the Ohio House, did you feel a broader responsibility to all the members, including those certainly on the other side of the aisle, the Democrats? Did you feel as Speaker you had a responsibility to all of them?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of the problems that I see in legislative leadership in Congress and some other states that I hear about. The speakership, or the head of the legislative house, obviously is the leader of that majority party. But there's another function, and that is Speaker of the body. And I think that's lost today in many situations.
It's all about partisanship.
Much too partisan. It helped while I was Speaker, we had pretty good majorities. So I used to say, well, if you've got the votes, you can afford to be magnanimous. A little outreach, work close with the minority leader. He or she needs some things. Fine, support each other. And the legislative body runs better when you can do that.
Elected public service should be the art of compromise, right?
Sure.
I mean, you met regularly with the minority leader to see what needed to be done.
A lot of it was in the function of the Rules Committee. I opened up the Rules Committee to the press. But I wouldn't take major actions, even in operation of the House, personnel-wise or otherwise, without consulting with the minority.
Now, you mentioned that you opened the Rules Committee to the press, and that leads me to my next question. You talked earlier about the media, the reporters who covered the Ohio legislature, the Correspondents Association. How did you balance the public's right to know with the need sometimes for the kind of backroom politics that helps get things done?
Gingerly. You remind me of Gilligan was proposing the creation of the Department of Environment, the Environment Protection.
Governor Jack Gilligan.
Yeah. And I thought the concept was good and so forth. And I thought politically it ought to be done too. And I remember driving back home Thursday afternoon, got home, and I had a committee obviously working on this. And I had a phone call saying, everything fell apart this afternoon after you left. So I said, okay, tomorrow morning, have these people in the Speaker's office. I'll be down. And we spent most of the day putting together the environment protection legislation behind closed doors. Some of the members who were not satisfied with how it turned out, highly critical of how we did it. The press, I don't think, as critical as you might think. I find that if the people like the result, they're going to be less critical about the process. If they don't like the result, the was a lousy process. So I either was high-handed in the way we did it, or I exercised leadership by bringing the people together, depending whether you like the result or not.
Chuck, you had an opportunity to be in the legislature with Democratic governors Jack Gilligan and Mike DeSalle. What was that like, having a governor from the other party?
Well, it's different because you're not meeting with him continually like we did with the administration. You're not part of a team. You are representing a co-equal branch. We weren't that partisan. There were times when we obviously took jabs legislatively, politically, but it was not, we didn't take the approach like a United States Senator says, my only job is to see that he doesn't get, the president gets reelected. Never an attitude like that. How we did things might have a political attribute to it, sure. But in a way, it's the governor, the governorship, and you respect it. And he was the kind of individual that you could like, you can respect, and so forth. And you know, I wasn't aware of the memorial service they had for him in Columbus, but if I had been, I'd have been there, because he was governor while I was speaker. Worked together on some things, like I just talked about the EPA bill, and so you're still working in some regards for the same result. Not always.
Of course, you mentioned Mike DeSalle, a Toledoan, which you served with as well.
Yeah, remembering I was a real young, low on the totem pole legislator at that time.
Now, you, of course, as a speaker, had a lot of young people working for you in the General Assembly, the pages. You'd been one yourself. Did you have a special appreciation for the work they do and the young men and women who worked for you?
Sure. Not only a feeling for them, but a high expectation. Early in the session, about 11 o'clock at night, I would have a meeting of all the new pages. And so they heard it from a page. Certain expectations. And one of them was said, your legislator got you this job. That's patronage. That's all they can do for you. They can't keep the job for you. And I had a couple instances where my administrative assistant, Lee Schaefer, or whoever it might be, terminated a page for good cause.
Did you have a reputation as a bit of a taskmaster with the pages?
I don't know. You'd have to ask them. But they knew.
The ones you let go would probably say that you did.
But no member ever succeeded in reversing that kind of administrative decision, because they'd been given the direction.
Okay, now you served as Speaker until what, 1972? Is that right? When the Republicans lost control of the House?
Yeah, it was.
I think it was 72, because I believe it coincided with my service in Columbus with the Blade. But you were elected by your caucus then as minority leader.
Yes.
Everything changed all of a sudden. Did the art of compromise become even more important to you? Because now you don't have the votes.
That election night, I was driving to Columbus. We'd lost control. I went up to the second floor where the office was. There was a deluge of reporters waiting to see me. I said, give me a couple minutes. I went in the office and got the latest briefing, and I remember, you won't, what I first said when the reporters came in. I said, I'm sure glad we have treated the minority as well as we have. But that didn't work. Understandably, the Democrats had been out of control for quite a while. Now they're in.
There were a few scores to settle.
Well, they thought they did. And so they might contest this, but I don't think they did not welcome or think they needed the input of the minority to the extent that we did.
Now, you served 3 more terms, and then in 1977, and you know we have to talk about this, you made a monumental career decision. You decided to challenge your own party's leader, legendary Ohio political leader and Governor Jim Rhodes, in the Republican primary for governor. Why did you take on Jim Rhodes?
Probably several reasons. First of all, the legislature was not enjoyable anymore, you know. When I didn't look forward to driving to Columbus for a legislative week, that's the time to quit. Plus, I'd been the leader for 12 years. I should step aside and let somebody else. I probably felt Jim Rhodes ought to do the same. But there was not a consensus at all, but some thought Jim may not run again. Well, if he's not going to run, anybody who's going to try for it's got to get in long before he's going to announce in January that he's not going to run. So if there's any chance that I was interested, those of who were working with me, I had to get in early. So at that point, you are challenging the leader.
Was Kent State a factor? Did you feel Governor Jim Rhodes was vulnerable years later, even though the tragedy had occurred at Kent State in 1970?
Kent State that episode was probably the most difficult, most upsetting experience I had in the legislature. I don't know if it factored in politically like that or not. Not only did he run again, but what was it? 8 years later, he ran trying for a third swing at it. So, you know, you got to chuckle when you think somebody thought he might not run for that second term the second time around. But then when he said, then you've got people who have said, we'll support you if you'll stay in. Well, so it's almost a no-win situation at that point.
Well, the primary was a no-win, as it turned out, correct? You lost badly to Jim Rhodes. What? I believe it was something like 2-1?
About 2-1.
Did you regret it?
Oh, sure.
Were you sorry that you challenged him at that point?
No, the biggest regret, you see, is it became clear to me I wasn't going to win. No, that the problem was there's too many people out there working for you who think you can win. And that's the regretful thing, that we let people down because they looked forward to our winning. And while I was sure it would have been nice, and not too bad for Ohio, by the way, but that's the bigger regret.
How did your relationship with Jim Rhodes evolve after your unsuccessful challenge?
Oh, well, I don't think it was too bad because he knew I was no challenge anymore.
Did he resent that you took him on?
I'd never asked him, but he certainly called me and asked me to make some speeches for him in the general election, which I certainly did. During that campaign, there was a group got together and did in fact, hired a private investigator, or at least whether they paid him or not, a private investigator, which became known, and the media had a little fun with that. But came time that they were ready to tell me. And so we were meeting at a motel out at the airport. I don't know how many people were there. I'm thinking 6 or 8. I don't know. So I went in and sat down with them. And I said, now, before you start telling me what you're finding, keep in mind this. I'm probably not going to win. and I am going to support Jim Rhodes in the general election. I don't want you telling me things that are going to make it difficult for me to support Jim Rhodes. And they said, why don't you go out and wait in the lobby for a while? 20 minutes, 30 minutes later, they came out and said, why don't you go on back to the State House? So what all they had, I don't know.
Now, about a year later, you decided to leave the legislature. You had challenged the governor. It didn't work out.
Well, no, that commitment was made because I had to run in the primary, either for re-election or for governor.
Right, so you're out of the legislature at this point. Did you miss it?
At that point, my standard answer was, yeah, like a bad toothache, keeping in mind it wasn't enjoyable anymore.
What had changed?
Well, I was in the minority, and the Republicans weren't welcome with input. And if you can't be part of it, it was just not enjoyable. Plus, I'd also been very active in legislative leadership across the country. I was president of the National Legislative Conference. I helped put together, by the way, 40 years ago, the National Conference of State Legislatures, which was the current organization of state legislatures across the country, headquartered in Denver, often cited by the media and others with information on what's going on in the legislature. And that had been a real activity of mine, something I was very active in and proud of. And so it had been more, that had been an accomplishment done. So it seems like I'd done what I could do.
You mentioned the National Convention as a source of pride, obviously. What legislative achievements could give you the most pride during your years in the legislature?
Well, two things. Some legislative things, sure. That Jim Rhodes recognized I got some things done that without my involvement would not have been done. But more than that, the upgrading of legislatures around the country, but specifically Ohio. Before I was Speaker, the members didn't have an office, didn't have a desk off the floor. You conducted all your business on the floor. You did your dictation, all your research, your seat on the floor. Right away, I got space in the State House. They got desks off the floor. During my tenure, we created a legislative budget office, fiscal office. The legislature was no longer dependent upon the state, the administration. Howard Collier, who was head of the finance area for the governor at the time, came to me and said, I support you in doing this. I often wondered if it was because he knew we were going to do it anyway, or I think legitimately he saw it as a need. When I became Speaker was one of those years, a whole new group of freshman legislators, because that was reapportionment. Reduced the House from 139 or 40 down to 99, lost all that senior membership. I could reorganize the committees, had good working committees. The committee chairs took, and I'm not saying that's any different today, took real pride in the workmanship. Before we took major bills on the floor, we had a session in my office on them, anticipating what should be done, could be done, what we might face. So I think legislatively, organization, we did well. They tell me I appointed the first woman to the Rules Committee, Ethel Swanbeck. All I remember is, I don't know, But the minority leader said to me, "Chuck, that won't work." I don't know what he meant by that won't work. I appointed the first female page. They'd all been men before. And you won't be surprised to know she was from Wood County. So structurally, operationally, I think we made some good improvements in them. At least at that time, I got the feeling that our openness in debate on the floor was recognized as somewhat more open than it maybe had been.
And perhaps more open than it became after you lost control of the House. We talked a little earlier about term limits, something you didn't have to worry about in the legislature.
I remember, by the way, when I succeeded Roy Longnecker, who'd been there 20 years, I said to a few people, "I'll never stay 20 years. Well, I left after 22.
Yeah, you were right in a sense. You served longer. But term limits, now of course, they dictate and they reshape our legislature all the time. Senior leadership goes away quickly. Are term limits a good idea for the legislature, or would you like to see them just go away?
The general consensus of the people who work closely with it, observe it closely, will say the result has been very negative. I've 4 or 5 times they came down and asked me to talk during orientation week for new legislators. Try to give them some sense of the institution, some feeling of loyalty, pride in the institution. That's a hard sell when they're going to be there a limited period of time. Now, there's several of them who have stayed for over 20 years just by jumping from the House to the Senate and the Senate and the House. That might contribute to a little continuity that is needed.
But also a certain public cynicism to a point.
I had a chat on the phone the other day with one of the speaker's staff, and talking about with the Constitutional Modernization Commission of going to be dealing with probably dealing with term limits. And the general agreement was, if you put repeal of term limits on the ballot, it'll be defeated. The same cynicism. One thing that they say, well, this makes the legislature more dependent on the lobbyists. The lobbyists get more control. I've always felt if anybody, including lobbyists, get too much control of the legislature, it's only because the legislature lets it happen. Others say staff will get more input. Well, they got a lot more staff than they used to, sure. But that's only if legislators let it happen. And legislators can become too dependent on lobbyists and even their own staff.
There was a time when Governor Rhodes considered appointing you to the Ohio Supreme Court, but you told the Blade's Tom Reinders several years ago that you were, quote, not all that interested in it, end of quote. Do you remember that? And why not?
Do I remember everything I said? No, I don't.
Well, it's right there in black and white.
Yeah. Well, I liked being speaker. I was doing a pretty good job at it, being pretty effective, even for the governor, primarily for the governor. I probably didn't feel ready in my profession, the law, for that. A couple times they would call me from Columbus and say, would you consider running for the Supreme Court? I said, I think I'd make a good Supreme Court justice. I think I'd make a good candidate for the Supreme Court. And until somebody from Scioto County or down the Ohio River by the name of Brown decides they want to be on the Supreme Court. Those campaigns weren't as notorious as they have been since. And so I was not ready to undertake something like that. There was also a little problem at that point when Jim talked to me about that. And by the way, it was after the memorial service for Bill O'Neill that he talked to me about it. Well, when he talked, when I say he talked to, he makes this casual remark, and you remember Jim Rose, he was that way. You never spent much time seriously talking about anything. But we had raised the salary for the Supreme Court, and you've got that constitutional provision which says a member of the legislature cannot take an appointment to a position for which the salary had been raised. So we would have faced that also. And I didn't feel I wanted to get in that mishmash.
Now, in addition to Jim Rhodes, Chuck, you also worked with another giant in Ohio politics of the 20th century. You know who I'm talking about, Vern Rife. What sort of relationship did you have with the longtime Democratic leader and speaker?
You know, my career, things happen in my career that they're not things I planned, worked towards, but somebody else is always leading me somewhere. Bob legislator, a good legislator from Cincinnati, whose name slips me at the moment. When he left the legislature, he said to me, "Chuck, get on the Public Improvements Inspection Committee." I didn't know it existed. But I got on it, and they made me chairman. This is a committee that was created under Frank Lausche because the legislature would make appropriations to get things done, and he wouldn't do them. So they had this legislative committee go around and try to see they get done. So I worked with that committee. One year we visited state parks, another one state hospitals, higher education. And Vern was on this committee. We became, I would say, politically, socially slash politically, very close and very supportive. He would, of course, he wasn't minority leader when I first became speaker, but did. So we had, I would say, a close relationship, probably until he became speaker, and it wasn't quite the same.
Well, the nature of your job almost dictated.
Nature of the jobs as he viewed them, yes.
You spent, after you left the legislature, I believe about 12 years out of elected public service. You came back home, you ran your law practice, but in 1990 that bug bit again, and you ran for and won a seat on the Wood County Common Pleas Court.
Yeah.
What got you back in elected office? Was it motivation? Was it opportunity?
Well, remember the two horses I was riding. The profession of the law was important to me, and that's part of it. That's a different aspect of that profession. And I was ready. There was a time I was ready to leave the legislature. I'm ready to move over into another part of the judicial or the legal profession. And it in a sense, it was a leadership role. After my first trial, one of the lawyers were coming in and out, that week, seeing what kind of judge they've got. And one of them mentioned to me that, at least, Chuck, you took charge. And I said, well, being Speaker of the House with 99 lawyer pretenders help.
You know what to do with a gavel. I don't mean to get all philosophical on you, Chuck, but at its very best, what is the law?
You're still a pretty good newsman with questions. I would say the law is a little bit more, but the tool by which society governs itself. One aspect, the legislature is another aspect, but it is a crucial spoke in that wheel of how society governs itself. When you're in the legislature, you govern itself as you're sort of reflecting the legislature, policy-wise. The difference in the judgeship is you're not trying to feel how did the public feel about this. Big, big difference. But it's sort of that not outside but peripheral part of society where you judge yourself, you control yourself, you put limits on, and you open doors. You require doors to be open for people in society. So it's a nice broad spectrum of activity, all for the, quote, betterment of our community.
Now, you did that for another 12 years, and in 2002, you were prohibited from seeking another term on the bench because of age limits. You were past the age of 70, and you couldn't run for office again. Except for that, would you have sought another term?
I was asked that. And my thought was, I might have sought another term, but I said, I don't think I would have promised to serve all 6 years. It was a little early, but hey, I was 72 at the time, and I don't think I would want to promise to do 6 years, and if I wouldn't promise to do that, I probably shouldn't run.
Well, it's not like you suddenly had nothing to do, because that same year, you were appointed to a state task force on jury service and reform. Did that turn out to be productive?
Oh, yeah. The jury aspect was one of the areas of the judiciary that I took a real interest in, and we changed some, not just myself, but I was among the group that changed some things. I changed the way I, quote, select. I don't like the word select a jury. It makes it sound like the judge and lawyers are picking and choosing. In a way, we were. But the standard was you put 12 people or 8 people in the box, you ask them questions, then you excuse some, you know. And my process, if you've got 28 people, you seat them all. You deal with all 28, not just the first 12. And then the selection process, you go by numerical order. The jurors don't know numerical order. The lawyers and the judge do. So you go through that process outside the hearing of the jury. We ended up letting them ask questions. Jurors ask questions, which is still not caught on widely. But there's different areas in dealing with the jury that we did things a little differently.
Do you think juries usually get it right?
Usually, yes. Not always.
Were there cases that came before you where the evidence that you were reviewing right along with the jury, and then they gave you a verdict that you didn't think was right?
Yeah, I've had a couple jurors where I think they did not make the right decision. I never tell them that. Sometimes it's because they don't fully understand the law, and that's a problem with the jury instructions, where you have to be so specific, so detailed, that you sometimes lose the jury. Sometimes they may not like the law, and so don't employ it the way it should be. Sometimes they make they're influenced by what they did not hear. Why didn't we hear this? Why didn't we hear that? Sometimes they're not sure they made the right decision. They will say, often in a criminal case, we think the defendant's guilty. But the prosecution did not meet the standard the court gave them to establish. And that's part of the process.
Why do you think so many people consider jury service a nuisance?
I used to say, when that panel of jurors shows up in the morning, 2/3 of them would rather be somewhere else. By the time they hear about the case, 2/3 of them hope they can be on the jury. I made every effort, and other judges do, to make jury service an experience, a rewarding experience. I remember I had a guy, I forget his name, he's from Walbridge, I remember that, in a tough criminal case, say to me afterwards, "This is one of the most trying experiences I've ever had, and that includes my military service. But if you need me next week, I'll be here." That's the kind of experience jury service should be.
You had a long and distinguished career both as a legislator and a judge. We talked about both. Which gave you the greater personal satisfaction, legislating or adjudicating?
You know, I don't think I can compare the two. They're so different that they're hard to compare. Takes a lot of the same interests, same attributes, but I don't think I would pick. If you ask me, my problem is this: if you said do it again, Kurfess, I'd probably, unfortunately, for both, do it again the same way. I'm not satisfied at all that I did my best. These people that retire and say, "Gee, if I had it to do all over again, I wouldn't change a thing." I would change almost every aspect of my life a great deal if I could do it again.
But you had two careers.
I had more than that. I had family. I had, many, everything that I've done, I could have done a heck of a lot better.
Well, let me perk up your feelings a little bit by sharing a story. It's a great story about a former political opponent of yours, and I think you know what I'm talking about. He wrote you a letter many years ago, decades after you had defeated him in a campaign, and he wrote to apologize to you for his treatment of you during the campaign. And I'm going to quote from that letter because you gave it to me. He apologized for his harsh campaign tactics, which he said were based on, quote, "slim, uncharitable, and debatable gleanings from your record, rather than an overarching fairness to your many years of public service to the people of Wood County and Sandusky counties and Ohioans in general." What was your reaction to that?
I chuckled because that kid who had a recent graduate of Bowling Green University ran one of the best campaigns against me. I remember he hit on 4 or 5 issues. And after he enunciated them the first time, I went back to the office. I called Columbus, and I think I talked to Lou Heckman, who you might remember is on our staff. I said, on this one, why did I vote on that one that way? And he said, "Well, Chuck, you didn't like the way it came through the process," which is a heck of a good lesson to learn. Process is important. I'm sure that if I sat down, there's no question, I don't think I ever did anything in a campaign for which I feel I should apologize for, but there's certain things I would do differently.
As we sit here in early 2015, you are 85 years old, or about to be.
Yes.
How do you feel about getting older?
I heard a sermon once, and we talked about that, concluding, a sermon about older people and accomplishments they've done. And so it leaves one thing, what is there undone that I'm to be doing? Out of that came a phrase that, I don't know if the pastor used or I do, persons of possibilities. When do you end up being a person of a possibility? And maybe I'm getting close. I've been an acting judge ever since I retired, and it's gone on much longer than I anticipated.
You're still accepting judge assignments?
No, I'm not accepting assignments, but I'm trying to wrap up a case that I first took in 2011. So we're still working, but I think
that'd be it.
No, I think that's done. Knock on wood. But no, it's sort of like wondering what should I be doing.
Well, it's still too early, obviously, to talk about your legacy. But what do you hope it will be?
Normally, I would say he'd done his best. But I don't think I did. So,
well, a lot of Ohioans would disagree with you, Chuck.
My legacy, it was enjoyable. I'd like to do it again.
But you would change a few things. I think you made that perfectly clear. Chuck, it's been wonderful having this time with you, and I thank you for the gift of your time. And I enjoyed this conversation very, very much.
You're always a pleasure to talk with.
I'll see you at the basketball games. Of course, we thank you as well for your interest in the Sight and Sound Video History Series at the Toledo Lucas County Public Library. Please join us next time. And remember, keep reading and keep learning.